Thank you all. This is the latter part of the marathon. I mean, I've never run a marathon, but I imagine that the latter part of it is worse than the earlier part of it. So, thank you. I would have taken a break and stopped running by now, but thank you all for making it this far. Before we get started, I did want to call your attention actually to the conference that's happening in this space immediately after this on Sunday and Monday. For those of you who are part of the FIU community, Professor Wasserman is putting on a conference on anti-Semitism, the law versus anti-Semitism. You may have noticed that in the course of the morning they put up banners that are something that the German equivalent of the American Bar Association, the German Bar Association, if there is such a thing, has a exhibit of different prominent Jewish lawyers that were sort of run out of the profession in the 1930s, and I think that it is just a sobering. These are the banners that have been put outside in the atrium. If you can have a moment to take a look at them and look at some of those stories, I think it's a very sobering reminder of how precious democracy is, and how much we need to fight to protect it. So with that, I will sit down and introduce. Now I am a panel. I am a moderator on this panel, and this is. I'm happy to be. I'm happy that Professor Troxler is here, Professor Obi, Professor Weinkle, Kevin Dayaratna. I'll introduce them in a moment. I'll just say that this is the topic of this panel, Science and Public Choice in Climate Policy, was the theme of the entire conference that we had last time around in March of last year. And it sort of is really the theme of all of these conferences that we've put together, the FIU Environment Forum, because if you've noticed, if you look down, I mean, some panels, because of the topic, are all lawyers. Others of them are sort of all scientists, but there's a general pattern. If you look at these panels, that a lot of them will start, like this panel, will start with scientists to tell us what the science is saying, and then we move to economists, finance professor, business school professor, a lawyer, a statistician. The lawyer here is me. I might have some comments after all the panelists have had a chance to talk. And this is a very sort of important and natural progression I teach environmental law here at the College of Law, and one of the basic things that we start with is the difference between risk assessment and risk management. And risk assessment is, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow more in the Volo Foundation lecture and conversation, if you can come to that for the lunchtime keynote. Risk assessment is sort of the objective exercise that we hope scientists can do to tell us, for example, at the Environmental Protection Agency, there's a potentially hazardous air pollutant. What's the dose response? How many people are potentially affected? How many people might get sick? And then there is the risk management part. And the risk management part is an inescapably, we hope that it is science-based. We hope that it is fact-based, but it is an inescapably political exercise, and that involves policy trade-offs. And so the appeal to scientific authority, the scientific, even in science-based policy, the science can't answer some of those policy questions. We hope that it answers as many of them as possible, but at the end of the day, we rely on the democratic process to make the trade-offs, right? The Department of Transportation collects highway crash data, but if they set the speed limit, they would set it at 5 miles an hour, right? We set the speed limit at 65 because people have decided that they want to absorb a certain level of risk, or the de facto speed limit on 836, if you've been on 836, is essentially no speed limit. Well, it's 55 miles an hour, which is basically the same as no speed limit, since there isn't a Cuban within 20 miles of 55 miles an hour on the speed limit. Anyway, I digress. But it's very important to have science-based rules, and how we get to rules in a political process that are science-based is not always easy, and it's not always easy to understand. So that's what I hope this panel will explore, and this is the order in which I hope the speakers will speak unless pandemonium breaks out. Professor Tiffany Troxler will go first. She's immediately to my right. She's a research scientist and associate professor at the Southeast Environmental Research Center in the Department of Biological Sciences here at Florida International University. Her research focuses on wetlands ecosystem ecology and informs management and restoration of coastal and freshwater wetlands ecosystem. She's also the project collaborator and working group co-lead in the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER program. And she is associate director and associate director for science of the Sea Level Solutions Center. There are fuller biographies here that in the interest of time, I'll just direct you all to the program. To her right is Professor Jayantha Obeysekera, or as we know him, Obi. Professor Obi is the director and research professor in the Sea Level Solutions Center. Obeysekera previously served as the chief modeler at the South Florida Water Management District, where he had a leading role in the modeling of the Everglades and Kissimmee River restoration projects. He was the co-author of the Sea Level Rise Projections Report published by NOAA for the National Climate Assessment, and a lead author for the Southeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment. He served on the Federal Advisory Committee, which directed the development of the National Climate Assessment in 2014. To his right, we have Professor Jessica Weinkle, who is an associate professor of public policy and coordinator of the Coastal and Ocean Policy Program at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Her broad research interests are in the interface of science, policy, and politics, with current projects in research ethics, in climate science, state-level science advice. Jessica provided testimony to the United States Senate and maintains a Substack newsletter, the Substack newsletter Conflicted. She holds a doctorate in environmental studies from the University of Colorado Boulder, a master's of arts in climate and society from Columbia University, and a bachelor's from the very cool University of Texas at Austin. And then to her right is Dr. Kevin Dayaratna. Dr. Dayaratna explores questions at the boundaries of policy, statistics, and economics as chief statistician, data scientist, and senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Center for Data Analysis. An applied statistician, he has researched and published on the use of high-powered statistical models in public policy, medical outcomes, business, economics, and professional sports, among many other fields. And so with that, Professor Troxler, take it away.
Thank you. I got slides. You guys already saw the sneak preview. Hello. Awesome. Okay. Yes, you got to see this slide already. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. So you may recognize this. This is Venice, Italy, St. Mark's Cathedral. And what you see here are tourists that are trying to access the cathedral from walkways because there is flooding in the fall of 2022. And so these are phenomena that we know are happening in many cities around the world, including Miami and several cities here in Miami-Dade County. And what we understand is that more accelerated action on adapting and mitigating climate change is necessary. Unfortunately, it's not happening fast enough, and we might be able to attribute some of that to mistrust between science and politics. And so Italy's solution to this was to develop a new institutional framework for collaboration between science and politics, recognizing that only by uniting on the already increasing impacts of climate change could the best solutions be found to other problems central to societal progress, including jobs, immigration, security, and taxes. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is a case study in which we are working to build more trust between science and politics through research, monitoring and evaluation. So enter the Resilient 305 strategy. So this is Miami-Dade County, or the Greater Miami and the Beaches strategy to address resilience challenges that were prioritized through intergovernmental and community collaboration. It's intended to promote intended to promote a better Greater Miami and the Beaches, where we can all live, work, and prosper abundantly. And ultimately, its implementation is intended to shape the ways in which in which our communities across Miami-Dade County will move, adapt, flourish, grow, and evolve to create a region that will serve as a gold standard for resilience worldwide. So it's broken down into a couple of goal areas, places where there are 19 actions that were developed in order to address place-based challenges. A goal area referred to as people, where 22 actions were developed intended to improve everyday lives, and pathways, where 18 actions were developed to enhance collaboration and leadership. And so as part of this strategy, essentially the chief resilience officers that were in charge of pulling all this together asked our anchor institutions, including Florida International University, University of Miami, Miami-Dade College, and in fact challenged us to help to understand how we can improve and in fact try to meet the outcomes that are intended with the Resilient 305 strategy. And we were quite inspired by the collaborative effort that produced the strategy, in that it brought local jurisdictions together that don't always see eye to eye on every issue. So this is the structure of that collaborative, the Resilient 305 collaborative, and it's essentially the research, research, monitoring and evaluation arm of the Resilient 305 and its strategy. It's co-directed by two faculty, one University of Miami and myself, and we have a gentleman at Miami-Dade College who is helping to foster and support this. Our local governments, Miami-Dade County, the City of Miami Beach, and City of Miami. Some of our community-based organizations, among them the Clio Institute, and also supported by our local community foundation, the Miami Foundation. And so working together, we're working through a process that helps us to understand how we are meeting the outcomes that are intended by the Resilient 305 strategy. But if you talk to any resilience officer or anyone else trying to implement resilience in communities, they say we're building the plane as we're flying it. There's no playbook for this. And so what we devised is a process, even a system, for trying to understand, as we continue to invest in resilience across Miami-Dade County, how can we improve that process over time to not only meet the intended outcomes of reducing climate risk, but also to deliver what we refer to as resilience co-benefits or resilience dividends. And so part of that process involves meeting communities where they are, understanding what people prioritize, what they value, working through the strategy to try to develop quantitative metrics to help us understand whether we're meeting the outcomes as these programs and projects are being implemented, and having a robust system for monitoring change in climate hazards within communities. And so looking at those three areas of work in a crosswalk against what resilience projects are being implemented where and how, we start to see a process by which we can decompose the information that comes from those important community-based information and the investments that are being made to understand how we do a better job of implementing resilience in our communities with each resilience investment. And that actually, cues back to some of the earlier panel's comments about implementing adaptive management as a way for us to understand and learn how to improve the outcomes of these projects over time. And so you say, how do you measure climate hazards in communities across Miami-Dade County? This is 34 jurisdictions plus Miami-Dade County, almost 3 million people. We have a lot of diversity in geologic or geographic conditions, socioeconomic conditions across Miami-Dade County, and that is supported by the work of citizens. We have base monitoring that we do in terms of understanding flooding and temperature as well as humidity, and then those measurements are supplemented by citizen scientists that get out into the community and help us to deliver a more a more widely spatially distributed set of data that we can use to understand how climate hazards are changing over time. And so there's some progress and opportunities to call out here. So what we're trying to do here is position ourselves as a community so that as these investments really start rolling, we can understand how we're actually moving the needle on improving these benefits and the co-benefits, the added value that we can get from resilience investments beyond just reducing climate risk. And so some of those things are actually referenced earlier. I think Galen talked about the coastal storm surge risk reduction planning process that was being led by the Corps, still being led by the Corps, but what happened was the process wasn't going very well because community input wasn't being integrated in an effective way, and essentially we restarted the process to take a look at how those interventions to reduce coastal storm surge risk bring more comprehensive benefits to across our communities. The federal funding that's coming, the state is, they're slowly, but also making some contributions more in the capacity of helping communities plan for climate change so that they can be eligible for larger investments. And then also through project integration, there's a lot of work going on to integrate what's happening at local, state, and federal level so we can get more synergistic benefits from these projects as they're being planned and implemented. And then I have to reference Lucas there, PhD student who's waist deep in Everglades water. Everglades is one of our most important natural assets here in South Florida, and we're seeing a lot more water getting into the park, which is helping to promote its resilience and all the benefits that system provides to us. And that's it. So thank you very much.
You can sit there, or if you have slides.
Yeah, I have slides.
Okay.
So let me wait for the slides.
1 minute, please.
We engineer in me always wants to use some slides to make the point. Because sometimes it can be very complex. So just to kind of, before my slides come up, so I'm not going to talk about mitigation. I'm going to talk about adaptation, I think, in terms of solution. But I'm also going to talk about how the science, which is very complex, maybe can inform the public policy and, more importantly, strategies that the public, the governance structure could utilize. In an environment of complex science, but more importantly, something that I'm going to address is this concept of deep uncertainty. We talk about, anyway, let me get to it. I have a long name, as you can see. I'm in the Sea Level Solution Center in the Institute of Environment. So this is a slide I'm going to spend some time on. We know the climate is very complex now. Science is highly uncertain. We wonder why you have such a broad range of sea level rise scenarios. We don't understand the ice sheet melting very well, or the models cannot simulate that very well. That has been characterized as one of deep uncertainty that I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about the heat stresses and all that. I think we heard about some of that today. But what you see on the upper right-hand side is kind of a cartoon of what we have a system. It's a wonderful living laboratory for what I would be describing. We have these multiple drivers affecting urban natural system that we have in this region, affected by sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, rising groundwater level, which is something not many people across the country have, plus also maybe possibly intensification of extreme rainfall. So we have these compounding effects, but more importantly, it's what we call non-stationary. It's something we don't teach in schools yet, but I think we have to start thinking about how do we plan for future conditions, or teach the new generation how to plan for future conditions. I'll come back to that. But I think, like Todd mentioned, this is one of the most complex water management systems in the world. I've looked at this for many years, and they have these very complex systems of canals and control structures. And when they planned and designed in the 50s and 60s, they did not think about sea level rise. And those structures are not functioning the way it should. And twice a day, they cannot open the gates because oceanside water levels are higher. Now, I asked somebody at the Water Management District who worked in the 60s, why didn't you think about sea level rise when you guys planned this? He said he asked his boss, and his boss told him, let's leave that for the next generation, right? And that's what I heard from him. So anyway, we are here. So the thing that is complex is, this concept of non-stationarity. We cannot think about a fixed level of risk anymore. We have a dynamically changing risk, or dynamic return periods. We cannot talk about 100-year storm anymore. 100-year storm might be a 50-year storm 30 years from now because of the climate change, right? So we have what I call dynamically resilient sustainability. But when you look at sustainability, you see on the lower right-hand side the intersection of these Venn diagrams. You really have to look at it's at the intersection of at least three things I have identified here: the economic system, and the social system, and environmental system. And these interactions can be complex. We had a workshop funded by National Science Foundation a couple of years ago on copeline and people, and we tried to see, can we couple these models together? We quickly realized the level of maturity of these models are different, and the interoperability of these models are not that simple, particularly the social behavioral system. We don't understand, and we heard some of that earlier today. We don't understand how people react to this changing environment, right? So we really need some science on that. So with that, local governments will, typical jobs they have to come up with resilient infrastructure, disaster preparedness, and the other thing they have to look at is the social equity, and we talked about that earlier, and also how do we make sure the vulnerable populations are protected through time, because it's a non-stationary system. So with that, because of this concept of deep uncertainty, we really have to come up with, this is where the science comes into the public policy, this concept of decision-making under deep uncertainty. And there's a society of deep uncertainty, and now, we had 10 years. I went to the workshop in the Netherlands last year. But more importantly, I think there is a strategy that we could use. Again, coming up with adaptation solution, this concept called dynamic adaptive policy pathways that I'm going to explain. But more importantly, because of this uncertainty, we really have to come up with a strategy that's palatable to the public policymakers. And to me, this is kind of a win-win situation, because this strategy will make sure that in the next few decades we are sustainable while not forgetting the long-term outlook and not preempting your solutions in the long run. not like solving the problem for today. You look through the entire planning horizon, but you don't do everything right up front. That's the beauty of this approach. So with that, and I'm going to explain this. Let me see if I can get all this animation up. No. So this strategy is like what is popularly known as a metro map. It's like a subway map. If you go to DC or New York, you have these lines. Those are different actions that you can think about for your adaptation strategy. And this is where the new paradigm is needed to think about this type of strategy. And at the bottom of this metro map, you have these drivers, in this case, sea level rise, but we are looking at other metrics, other drivers that might be affecting social aspects and so forth. So the idea is you start with a particular action. At some point in time, that particular action will not work anymore because of the sea level rise or some other driver. And that's when you start thinking about that's a tipping point, and you switch to another pathway. But the beauty of this approach is you think through the whole thing right up front. And then on the right-hand side, you see the table where you look at the costs and the benefits. And if it is, if you cannot come up with dollar amounts or nature-based solutions, it could also include other types of metrics. So this dynamic adaptive policy pathways is something the Dutch have promoted, and we have adopted that in, at least in one case in Miami. We came up with a strategy to phase in your solutions that you don't spend the money up front for the biggest project, but you develop a strategy to phase in and come up with tipping points when to implement certain phases of that solution. So that's palatable to the decision makers and the policy makers because they don't have to come up with a lot of money up front. So I think that's a very prudent strategy to follow. And my last slide, I really like this resiliency principle. This is the new paradigm I think we need to think about. Earlier we talked about the system approach. You don't look at small areas. You really need to look at entire system because there are a lot of interactions. And one aspect, one simple example is you don't want to build a higher bridge over to a barrier island if the barrier island is going to be underwater, right? So you need to expand your spatial domain to look at the entire system. And the other second and third is, based on this, the concept of non-stationarity, you really have to design beyond the design. We engineers typically design for a particular quantity. We had to think beyond the design events and make sure that your infrastructure will remain functioning if it fails once. For example, a seawall, if it overtops once, make sure your seawall does not fail and it will continue to function. So it's a matter of risk tolerance at that point. And then the recovery capacity, and also how do we make sure that we remain resilient into the future. So my message here is that this science of these uncertainties in the climate science itself direct us to come up with a strategy that's palatable, that embraces that uncertainty and develop phasing in of infrastructure that is suitable for resilience. So that's all I have to say. I hope I didn't go over time.
No, fantastic. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Jessica Weinkle, University of North Carolina at Wilmington. What I'm going to talk about, I think, really covers and hits on a lot of different. What I'm going to talk about but hits on a lot of different themes over the course of the day, which I'm really pleased to see. But it's a look at science itself rather than and looking at the politics and the pressures that are being put on climate science given the current state of affairs in climate policy, climate politics, and the pressure that I believe that's coming from the financial industry on science. And it's been going on for a while. But I just wanted to point out that the work is a piece of a collaboration that I have with Roger Pilkey over at CU Boulder. So I have like one central point. A dynamic system of conflicts of interest among science advisors in the climate intelligence industry anchors outdated science into scientific research, financial regulations, and climate policy. So I'm going to talk about a little piece about outdated science, but it really encompasses a larger issue about specific assumptions that are being used that favor some interests over others. In the last panel, there was a concern about what groups in society are being favored in our discourse about climate. And so when we select some assumptions over others, there's winners and losers, trade-offs, if you will, in that decision. This dynamic is a longer-standing issue in discussion about democracy generally. Famously, Eisenhower spoke about it in his farewell address when he described the military-industrial complex and that all that going on there. So there's a rather serious controversy in climate science, and it's been going on for a number of years now, about emission scenarios and the assumptions embedded in the development of emission scenarios that drive climate change projections, that are used in climate change projections. The most commonly used for just over the past 10 years has been this the high ones, the 8.5 ones, well, RCP 8.5, and then in the last climate assessment, the IPCC assessment, came the SSP 8.5, which are identified as extreme and implausible. In prioritization of emission scenarios going forward, there will be a focus on this next one down, SSP 7.0. But in the literature, the developers of that scenario came out and said there's the focus on this scenario is misinterpreting why the scenario was developed and what it was intended to do, and it's being used incorrectly as far as estimating climate risk, physical risks. So then you get bumped down to, let's say, 4.5. And the SSP 4.5 scenarios, that family of scenarios, are estimated as the plausible upper bound. So this is your plausible high, at least at 2050. But currently, it's usually characterized in various places as the mid-range. This is a moderate look at emissions. That framing necessarily requires the continued legitimacy of these extreme scenarios above it. So rather than looking at 4.5 as a plausible high, it's being continually characterized as a mid-range. So contentious are these scenarios that there has been fairly considerable political effort in legitimizing them. So this is a document put out by the Biden administration, the White House, earlier last year, continuing to legitimize 8.5. And you can see similar efforts in different ways at the state level going on. There was recently something that happened in North Carolina that sought to continue to legitimize this. So it's a thing. So the scenarios remain pervasive and in rather significant places too. So they're being used in to estimate damages in the central banking coalition known as the Network for Greening the Financial System. It has to do with kind of ESG sorts of things. They're found in approved models for estimating hurricane risk in the Florida market. I can't see my own slides. They're showing up in official science advisory reports, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You see them in research coming out of those working for the Federal Reserve and other government agencies. So why is this happening? Well, climate change is big business, right? We've talked about rather significant financial activities over the course of the day. You talked about reimagining urban spaces. There was the talking of, we've talked about insurance, we've talked about investments, we've talked about all this stuff. Climate science has become a key part of that. And so there's the shaping of investment activities around climate change projections. And there's a rather significant media dynamic that goes along with this as well. So as we have either significant climate events or significant papers that come out that sort of spin visions of extreme climate change, you get a media dynamic, a media frenzy, and that starts to influence investor activity, which is then used, then the media itself is being used as a metric to hedge investments, and it kind of goes back and forth. And that's before you even start talking about the actual business of scientific publishing and how they're playing a role in creating this as well. So the end result, or part of this, because of the growth, and this has been going on for a while, as I said, but part of the growth in financial pressure on climate change science or financial industry interest in the science has been a growth in conflicts of interest between researchers and the industry. It's a problem, I think, that a lot of this stuff is going undisclosed. It's not so much that it's happening, it's that because it's not being disclosed readily, it is difficult to tell how much of science is being, how much of climate change science is being mobilized and motivated by financial interests. The top paper doesn't really relate to emission scenarios, but it was responsible for spinning the media storm over Category 6 hurricanes. The bottom paper was a effort to legitimize the evaluation, the methodology used in a McKinsey report that was very influential. On the other side of the slide, you see where what I'm trying to depict is that key individuals and key teams that are responsible for prioritizing scenario development and use for, or prioritizing what scenarios are significant for the climate change research community going forward. Those individuals also have a relationship and are working with the financial industry, for example, the Network for Greening the Financial System. All right, so in conclusion, and this is just one example, it's a larger, complex situation, but scientific integrity is a public interest value goal because empirical evidence is a tool of democratic accountability. We care about science, not just for science's sake, but because it allows us to intervene in the world, including our political systems and holding our policymakers accountable. This dynamic system of conflicts of interest is leading to regulatory capture by emission scenario, if you will, where you have analytic firms and advocacy organizations, often analytic firms, often doubling as advocacy organizations. They produce research, and then their consultants are then writing science advisory reports for government. And then while the firms do what firms do by shaping regulation and policy. So it's, if you start looking at who is also being brought in for congressional testimonies and the relationships with the firms, with congressional leaders, you start to see more of a iron triangle going on. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mario, for moderating this panel. My name is Kevin Dayaratna. I'm the Chief Statistician, Data Scientist, and Senior Research Fellow. And I'm going to talk about science and public choice and public policy, particularly with regards to energy policy. So energy, in and of itself, is literally the fundamental building block of society. From enabling us to power our homes, to drive our cars, to enabling this very meeting to operate, energy is literally the basis of anything and everything we do. And in terms of policy, it has been linked to climate change. We have heard over the years that the climate is changing. Some of us may say that we've noticed some aspects of this ourselves. We've heard that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases contribute significantly to the so-called problem. And we've heard that action must be taken. So what so-called solutions have been proposed? We've heard of many solutions over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We've heard of cap and trade, the Clean Power Plan pursued under the Obama administration, the Paris Agreement, which President Biden recently re-entered us into, the Green New Deal suggested by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, and a variety of state-level initiatives as well, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, cap and trade in California, cap and trade in Oregon, and so forth. Now, we are going to talk about a variety of modeling exercises pertaining to energy policy and climate change. First thing I want to get to is, what are these policies predicated on? And the answer is the social cost of carbon. What is the SCC? It's the abbreviation for the social cost of carbon. It first entered regulatory policy when it was proposed as a basis for regulatory policy by the Obama administration. And it has been defined as the economic damages per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon. The Biden administration is resurrecting these models, and the general question becomes, what is the long-term economic impact of CO2 emissions across a particular time horizon? The Obama administration used these three models, Dice, Fund, and Page, to get at this question. The Biden administration, in its resurrection of the SCC, has brought in three new ones: the DSCIM model, the GIVE model, and the Howard and Sterner meta-analysis model. Now, as with any statistical model, these models are based on assumptions. We have many assumptions that these models are based on. A few, for example. I was alluding to these damages being summed across a time horizon. How long? Well, these models take into account damages 300 years into the future. So that is one assumption that is made. Another assumption, discounting. That is assuming that damages are going to occur, what would be the rate of return on the associated investment to avert these damages from occurring? That is manifested in the discount rate. Manifestation is about the planet's sensitivity to carbon dioxide emissions, climate sensitivity. Most people would agree that the planet would warm with respect to CO2 emissions. The question is, to what degree? No pun intended. All these assumptions go into these models and many, many, many more. So it's a whole talk in itself to go into tweaking these assumptions, but at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis, we brought these models in-house, and we played with these assumptions. We tweaked them in very reasonable ways. We found that the social cost of carbon under the Dice and Fund model can drop by between 40 and 200%, and it can even be negative at times under very reasonable assumptions, suggesting that the social cost of carbon is either zero, or under negativity, it would suggest that government shouldn't be taxing CO2 emissions, but should be subsidizing it instead. Now, we of course don't take such a position, but the sheer fact that the models can suggest either under very reasonable assumptions really speak volumes to how open they are to user-selected manipulation. And we are working on doing the same analysis, the same type of robustness analysis under the Biden administration's new models as we speak. So what exactly is the SCC? Well, no one knows, but nevertheless, it is used to justify policies such as carbon-based regulation. So what we have done at the Heritage Foundation is also modeled a variety of energy policies regarding carbon-based regulation. And what I'm going to talk about today is President Biden's re-entry into the Paris Agreement. Specifically, the Biden administration, when it took office, sought nationally determined contributions for the United States regarding Paris to reduce GHG emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, with a goal of fully decarbonizing the electricity sector by 2035 and achieve economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050. So it's a great question. How can we model the economic impact of this approach? Well, at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis, we have the Heritage Energy Model, which is a clone of the Department of Energy's. This is a government model, the National Energy Modeling System. It's a government model just like the SEC models we looked at. And what we did was we examined a carbon tax to essentially, so regulations can be a little bit difficult to model in and of themselves. The idea is if you model a carbon tax, you can effectively discourage the most CO2 forms, I'm sorry, you can effectively discourage CO2 intensive forms of energy. So this is a challenging exercise. Any reasonable model is grounded in reality. So what we did was we pushed the model to its limits. Any reasonable model is grounded in reality and based on reasonable assumptions, and it is difficult for these models to actually engage in an imaginative process. I know that this is actually occurring in generative AI, but we're quite not there yet. So the question becomes, what can we realistically model? Well, if you actually try to model this with the Heritage Energy Model, again, a government model, the model crashes. So what we did was we instituted a variety of carbon taxes and pushed the model to its limits before it would crash. And as you can see here, you have a CO2 abatement curve. The x-axis is the level of the carbon tax. The y-axis is this reduction in CO2 emissions in 2030 with respect to 2005 levels. And you could see that under about a $37 carbon tax, you have a 36% reduction. We ramped it up. And at a $300 carbon tax, you get to a 44% reduction. Beyond that, the model crashes. So this, what I'm about to show you, is the economic impact under a $300 carbon tax, which is likely an underestimate of what the economic impact would be. So here you go. Like I said, energy is central to civilization. So if you start constricting the choices by discouraging certain forms of energy, there will be certain consequences. The Heritage Energy Model finds that you'll have a $1.2 million, an average employment shortfall of over 1.2 million jobs with a peak employment shortfall of over 7.8 million jobs. This is a time horizon through 2040. That peak would occur in 2026. Family income would drop. This is manifestations of GDP, per capita GDP particularly, a loss of $4,000 per year through 2040 with a cumulative loss of over $80,000. Household electricity costs would increase. Not surprisingly, you're constricting the choices of energy. So what do you see here? An average household electricity expenditures increase by approximately 25%. So altogether, what does this tell us? By instituting the associated regulations, by 2040, the country would incur an average employment shortfall of over 1.2 million lost jobs, a loss of income of over $87,000 for a family of four, up to 30% increase in household electricity expenditures, and an aggregate $7 trillion loss in GDP. Having said that, there are plenty of people out there that will say, okay, but that might be okay because we have to pursue these policies to impact the climate. So what is the climate impact of this policy? Well, at the Heritage Foundation, we have another model, the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change. This is an EPA model. And we assume commonly accepted projections regarding we assume commonly accepted projections, RCP 6, RCP 8.5, and so forth, regarding greenhouse gas emissions pathways going forward, as well as varied climate sensitivity ranging in ways that the IPCC has suggested, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. And we pursued a simulation eliminating all CO2 emissions from the United States completely starting in 2020. And what we want to discern is the climate impact toward the end of the century. What would happen? So here you have it. We have a variety of curves here. The gray curves are the current temperature trajectories that we're on. The y-axis is the temperature change. The blue curve is the hypothetical situation of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, particularly due to carbon dioxide, completely from the United States. And you can see, even under the worst case scenario of a 4.5 degree sensitivity, you have less than 0.2 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation by the end of the century. Namely, in the state of Florida, if the state of Florida were to completely decarbonize, you'd have less than 0.0043 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation by 2050 globally, and less than 0.0088 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation by 2100. And you'd also have pretty measly global reductions in sea level rise as a result. So the bottom line is, carbon-based regulation fails the test of cost-benefit analysis. But what can we say? Well, there is a link between affordable and reliable energy and human flourishing. Regardless of the form of energy, there is an inextricable link here between affordable and reliable energy and human flourishing. In particular, we have another paper, and this is more of a descriptive paper, looking at a statistical analysis of countries throughout the world. The x-axis is per capita energy consumption, and the y-axis is per capita income. This data is from 2018, and you can see the direct link here. As countries consume more energy, they have higher per capita GDP. Here is a plot about poverty. Here is, again, the x-axis is per capita energy consumption in kilowatt hours. The y-axis is the percent of the population living on less than $30 a day. And you can see as per capita energy consumption increases, this poverty rate plummets. Now, in public health, I was talking to somebody else about this earlier today. Again, the x-axis for all of these plots is per capita energy consumption. On the upper left corner, you have the number of doctors per 1,000 people. That skyrockets as per capita energy consumption increases. Japan is toward the top of the list. Life expectancy also increases. And on the other hand, child mortality and maternal mortality deaths plummet as per capita energy consumption increases. So what is the advice for policymakers? Avoid carbon taxes and carbon capture-related policies, as all they will do is shrink the economy with limited impact on the climate. And it is imperative that lawmakers understand the inextricable link between energy and human flourishing. That's how I started the talk, and the challenge is that many people take energy for granted, and these regulatory policies could have fundamental impacts on energy. Stop using the social cost of carbon for cost-benefit analysis, as it is highly prone to user manipulation. We're having a fun time with the new Biden administration's models, which are just as prone to user manipulation, if not more. And employ cost-benefit analysis, as was done here. Instead of talking about GHG reductions, let's go a step further and talk about temperature impacts. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
So I'll start with the question, and I know that we were talking. We've been talking. Professor Troxler and Obi talked about adaptation rather than carbon mitigation, but I have been struck by the proposals that I've seen, and I haven't seen all of them, but the proposals that I've seen about for a carbon tax rarely follow a Pigouvian model that says, here's the social cost of carbon. In other words, here's the numerical value of the externality of losses imposed by carbon emissions, and that's where we're going to value the tax. Most of the proposals that I have seen for a carbon tax have a much more direct route to reducing carbon emissions. They just try to impose a carbon tax in more or less the value that people sort of think would have an impact on carbon emissions, which is not a Pigouvian tax, right? That is a carbon tax that's being used as a rote policy tool to reduce carbon emissions, as opposed to a way of saying we're going to force polluters to internalize the externality of carbon pollution and then see what happens in the market, right? And so is that a problem from the point of view of is the uncertainty surrounding the social cost of carbon a problem from the point of view of a reliable and effective carbon tax? I would put that to.
It's not my area of expertise, but it's difficult for me to process model output without understanding all the assumptions associated with the output. That's all I can offer to that.
I was wondering, and Kevin knows this, I think, when you have a predictive model, you always do uncertainty analysis. I was wondering if there is a range of those SEC projections that, what is the standard deviation of the projection? Is that reasonable, or?
In terms of the social cost, in terms of the carbon tax as a Pigouvian tax?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Can I get a lifeline here from Professor Emmanuel, who I think might have an insight on this? Okay. From Dr. Schneider.
Just quickly, there are two ways of
have a different one. And the other way is to think about individual abatement. If price should also reflect a little bit the individual valuation of the good, so each person in each different environment would have a different abatement cost. And that is the problem with the social cost. You think that something might be there, and conceptually it even is there, but measuring it depends on the context and the aggregation level.
So is that, and can I just ask a question to hone in? Is that an objection, is that a difficulty of valuing the social cost of carbon, or is it a difficulty in the whole idea of a Pigouvian tax?
It is the difficulty of valuing the social cost. If we could somehow solve that difficulty, then we could, without much effort, find the tax rate for the Pigouvian tax.
And does everybody understand what a Pigouvian tax is? No. So a Pigouvian tax, this is a Pigou, French economist of the early 20th century or late 19th century, who posited that, that one way to deal with the problem of externalities in production, the externalities of a productive economic activity that produces pollution, is to say, well, what is the extent of the losses that that externality of pollution imposes on society? And let's come up with a number, and let's just impose a tax, per unit of production tax on the polluter, to force the polluter, in essence, to internalize the cost of that externality, right? So you're taking, the person's still imposing the cost on society, but by at least making an equivalent cost on the producer now is at least doing the right allocation of resources in terms of the level of production, right? Because the idea is, an externality is that if you're not taking the externality account in your, if you don't take the economics of that externality into account, then your marginal cost curve is artificial, and it is giving you the wrong signal of how much you should be producing. And so that's the idea. So to put it in simple terms, if a firm that uses a lot of fossil energy, to give an example, or that produces an activity that produces a lot of carbon emissions, if those carbon emissions impose major losses on society, and we can value a tax that takes those losses and translates it into a tax upon the producer, now the producer is looking at a cost of production per unit of production that looks very different than if they can just escape the value of, right, if they can just impose that externality on the rest of society. And so if the tax is high enough, they'll say, oh, okay, now that I have to take into account this externality, it doesn't look so good. It doesn't look so profitable to be producing so much of this thing. So I'm going to produce, less of it and avoid some of that cost. And then the problem becomes one of valuation. And I think that the Pigouvian tax this has generated an enormous amount of literature, economics literature, discussing the problems of the Pigouvian tax quite apart from climate change. And I see that my lifeline is finally coming online. Professor Emmanuel, microphone, please.
Well, I'm speaking from the narrow perspective of a climate scientist, but I see two things wrong with the concept of the social cost of carbon as it's practiced today. This comes somewhat from talking to economists at MIT, but some of it's my own. One is it's linear, and we know that's not right. That is, if you add a ton of carbon today, it'll cost you something, and forget about inflation, discount rates. Let's just say we had exactly the same economy in 50 years. Carbon dioxide's much higher. You add something that's going to cost something much more. Again, nothing to do with inflation or discount rates. It's just the nonlinearity of the response, particularly of extreme events. So that's my issue number one with the concept. A bigger issue is that we climate scientists are now, and I think have always been, very, very keen on trying to communicate to the people who have to make decisions the uncertainty in all of this. And the uncertainty has many, many sources. Jessica talked about the mission scenario. That's a big one. But there are all kinds of other uncertainties. There's modeled uncertainty. If we can't attach confidence limits to an estimate of the social cost, what good is it? Because we're not being fully honest about that. Yes, it's going to be tougher for policy people to deal with that. But to do anything less is just not honest. That's my view of the situation.
And so Professor Schneider.
Very brief comment on the linearity issue of the Pigouvian tax. So I'm not the biggest advocate of Mr. Pigou and his tax, but some countries try to build in nonlinear Pigouvian tax models, for example, Sweden or Switzerland. It didn't work out, but that's the practicality of politics that never works out. But they, at least in the model, they had it.
So I would say, so let me get a question back to, because I was struck by the presentations from the FIU professors here that were focused on adaptation and communicating the importance of adaptation, and the dynamic adaptive pathways that Obi was talking about. Uncertainty is not fatal to a policy of precaution, but uncertainty. So in the law we teach the famous learned hand formula that a small probability of a large harm or a large probability of a small harm are somewhat equivalent in dictating the precautionary measures that one has an obligation to take. And that the learned hand formula, named after the judge who it's not a descriptive form, it's learned hand was the name of the judge that came up with this in a famous case, it has been criticized, but the basic principle is that we have to deal with uncertainty all the time, and we can't use uncertainty as an excuse to not have policies. We just have to take it into account the right way. And so I guess I would just ask a question maybe to Obi to go deeper on this and how the uncertainty, because the uncertainty in the climate models has always seemed to me to say, it's not fatal to a policy of precaution, but it does seem to point us more towards more adaptation than necessarily carbon reductions as the policy response. And we see actually that the IPCC and the Green Climate Fund has been evolving in that direction. So.
Yeah, right. I think that's a good question. I'm not talking about the social cost of carbon, but in terms of adaptation strategies, we know how to deal with uncertainty. We've been, with money management and all that, right? But in case of climate modeling, and because of the model uncertainty and data uncertainty, and we have done some research, the biases can be up to 50% in climate extremes in these climate models. These are notoriously biased for extremes, not for temperature, more so for precipitation. So that's one part of uncertainty. And then the future greenhouse gas scenario uncertainty or pathway uncertainties, right? How the societies respond. So that's why I think there's a broad range of uncertainties in adaptation. And I work in California. Well, I'm on a Delta Independent Science Board in California. They're very interested in this concept of deep uncertainty because there you could have a broad range of uncertainty, and we range it from possible to plausible to, and the extreme case is what we call preposterous, like, pandemic, like, So I think we instead of not doing nothing in the face of uncertainty, we need to embrace uncertainty and use an adaptive pathway strategy and monitor what's happening. I'm not sure how to monitor the social cost of carbon, for example, and see where the tipping points are, but you have options open for you because in that pathway strategy, you have looked through all the options from the beginning. So to me, to deal with uncertainty, and at some point, one of the options could be retreating, for example.
Could be what?
A retreat from certain areas because your risk tolerance is high at, when the events increase, flooding increases 10 times a month or something. So I think you have those options open, but you have to make sure you take measures that do not prevent you from doing something bigger later. Like make sure you have the land available to do something. Or, California, they buy the land to build the levees, but they won't build the levees right up front. For example, right? Even in Miami Beach, they build the base of the pump station, they only put one pump. So I think there are strategies to deal with uncertainty And I think this way we have options to deal, dynamic adaptive pathway, I think is a way to deal with that and in any kind of climate adaptation.
And so the reverse side of the coin is that if it turns out that some of these models have been over predictive of certain risks, then at least we're not locked into a policy that's more costly than the risk.
Right, that is a good example. I'll give you another example of that, particularly related to that. So, we have these sea level rise projections from NOAA, like every 5 years or so, and I was involved in 3 of them, right? So in 2017, they projected sea level rise for Florida. In 2022, they updated the science. Now the curves are lower, about 10 inches lower.
So
and
10 inches by 2100?
By about 2060, right? So now the question is, the stakeholders are asking, you told us the curve was up here, now the new science says curve was down here. So I tell them, if the new curves were higher, then you would be worrying about it because your solution is not going to work. You don't have enough time. I tell them you have more resilience and you buy about 10 more years of your project. So I think that's not a worry in that case. So if the science does not, and we know there is uncertainty, it does not turn out to be what you projected, I think there are options to deal with. And the fact that you don't spend a lot of money up front in this adaptive pathway strategy, that will help you to deal with that kind of situation.
So then I have to ask the question, and we're going to go into this tomorrow with Jay Bhattacharya in the lunchtime lecture and conversation. But do you think that the original Michael Mann hockey stick and inconvenient truth and all of this, the fact that these, and I can kind of understand if you need to shock people into becoming aware of something that they're not even thinking about, you might feel an incentive to err on the side of worst case scenarios and talking about worst case scenarios. But do you think that it has made it more difficult to sell to the public in the long run, because we still see that for the public this is, for us it's a very important problem, but for people in the public it's like priority number 17.
Right. I think we need to educate the public because there are different shades of uncertainty, and those extreme scenarios might be relevant. If the damage or the loss of lives is huge, you need to think about that, right? I think that's the part that's missing. I'm not going to go to Miami Beach and say you have to leave now, and like some people would do, because you need to kind of see what is the phases that you have to go through until you reach a point where your risk tolerance is, high and is not as high. But I think that's not a very practical strategy to think of the extremes right up front.
And so let's talk about the extremes for a second. Here, something that I've participated in a lot of discussions here at FIU about are the problem that you mentioned of the canals, that we have a point at which, so sea levels are rising more slowly than we feared maybe, but the problem is that here in Miami we have such small margin for error, because if the sea levels rise 10 inches or something like that, then the entire system of canals will fail, and we won't be able to prevent pervasive flooding around the South Florida urban environment.
Yeah. So it's not the canal that would fail, it's the structures that were built 40 years ago. They were designed for about 6 inches tolerance in the flood time. So when the sea level is rising, we cannot open the gates because the ocean water would come inland. So now they're talking about maybe replacing those structures or retrofitting. But even that could be very complicated, because at some point, the water could come around those tieback levees and come into the canal. And at some point, some of the coastal areas might not be protected. So I asked this question from the Water Management District. Look, what is the situation with that? You're going to have Army Corps of Engineers spend a lot of money to build this coastal infrastructure like the Back Bay. At some point, you have to make sure your models can deal with that kind of situation. What I found is models are not designed for those extreme situations. And that's something people sometimes.
Because the structures aren't tall enough.
Yeah, structures. So the models were developed, in 10 or 20 years ago. They never thought about these extreme scenarios. Does physically the model work in those extreme scenarios? I think that's the part. So I think there are engineering solutions, but up to a point, I think. I mean, we went through that with Mike. We were looking at, what do we do with these structures? Like, do we move them upstream the canal? Then some people will, will not like that very much. They may lose the ocean access or whatever, right? So I think.
And so I would put the obverse of the question to Jessica and Kevin, and then get questions from the audience. But what if it's looking like RCP 8.5, even it's low confidence, even according to the IPCC, but it's possible. And how do we prepare? What policies do we prepare just as contingencies for these more extreme possibilities of what could be catastrophic climate change?
What do you mean by it's possible? So the development of the scenario relied on assumptions about the development of energy markets, particularly around coal, that have not panned out. And so as to whether or not it's possible, like one can imagine it, but it does not align with the knowledge about energy markets. So that I don't know if that it's.
Well, I mean, so the scenario, every national climate assessment, every assessment report of the IPCC has a new set of sort of integration of models on equilibrium climate sensitivity. They all they're sort of converging towards 4 degrees Celsius over time, but they've always had a lot of variability. So, and on the lower end of variability, it's like luke warming, as some people say, it's no big deal. On the upper end of variability, it's like very serious warming that could have very serious impacts. So even if we think that those are very unlikely, we still should be prepared, shouldn't we, with some kind of policy, a framework for dealing with the more unlikely and extreme scenarios, just on the basic principle that it's a small probability of a significant harm.
So, two things. Originally, the IPCC was set out to look at plausible scenarios. So they never did a really good job at fleshing out what plausible was, but that was supposed to be plausible. So if you have these scenarios that are being built off of assumptions about energy markets that are false, then whether or not they're in the realm of one's imagination, they start to fall off that criteria of plausibility. When you start then looking at others that do end up being plausible, you're saying, okay, this is the plausible high. Then you respond to that. So you're asking then of the plausible high, then what?
Yeah, the plausible but improbable high. What's the right policy framework for that?
Well, I don't know. That's an open discussion about what we ought to do. I have yet to hear much of anything that was discussed over the course of the day that would not make good sense regardless of climate change altogether, right? So these are big decisions about how we finance our urban spaces, how we design our urban spaces, how we maintain equitability across diverse populations. Like, all these things are good, right, and just ideas that really have very little to do with climate change. And so if you think about those and then say, okay, and plus a hedge because we think things might change somewhat, then you can take a lot of that uncertainty and controversy and kind of off the table and just say, okay, well, what kind of hedge can we afford? What kind of hedge is politically acceptable for our community?
Do you have anything to add to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you raise a very interesting question, Mario, about supposing the worst case scenario is true, that we are headed toward a catastrophe. So when I did the carbon tax modeling, that was on the economic impact, and the $300 carbon tax only achieved a 44% reduction. You notice in the climate simulation side, we assume that the United States reduced emissions completely to zero, and there was still no meaningful impact on global temperatures. So the bottom line is, even if you had $1 million carbon tax, it still wouldn't do anything regarding the climate. Now, why? Because the bottom line is, if you look at all the countries worldwide, China is the biggest emitter. The United States does not contribute nearly at the level that China does. So that is where emissions are coming from, if they are indeed a serious negative externality. I personally think that there is a vast amount of uncertainty regarding this, and I personally am in the lukewarming camp regarding this. But the bottom line is, even if you had a multi-million-dollar carbon tax here, even if you could magically eliminate fossil fuels off the face of the United States, it's not going to meaningfully impact the climate.
Questions from the audience? Mike. Can we get a microphone to Mike's Professor Sukop?
Have a position like that, because I feel like the U.S. has a responsibility to be an example, basically. And even if China and the rest of the world continues to go, we have a responsibility to cut our carbon emissions, in my opinion, just to be an example.
But would a carbon tax be the best way to get there? That's the question. Or could there
Apparently
be better
not.
ways? For example, with natural gas, for example, you have a lower carbon footprint. Could we free up the energy markets, have maybe a nuclear power renaissance in the United States?
That sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying, there are people out there that would say we should pump more CO2 out in the atmosphere because it's good. They actually believe that the social cost of carbon is negative. I'm saying it's all over the map, and you can't pin a number on it.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is the carbon-based regulation is not going to work. That's what I'm saying.
At least here in the United States, but if we had one, it would provide an example to the rest of the world. We have a role as a global leader in many things, and I just feel I can't believe the foundation is so insular to not see that, and I think I better stop because I'm too emotional about it.
Well, no, hold on though, Mike. But I think it's. But
I didn't say. I did not say anything about fossil fuels in this entire talk.
We know better because we know about the Heritage Foundation.
Well, let's not put people. Let's focus on.
And coal, and your buddy rolled back 125 EPA regulations when he was president.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we have to put people into boxes and labels and stuff like that. I think we could just deal with the questions. And I will say that the energy minister of India made clear at the COP that they are not going to sacrifice development to achieve Paris goals. So it sounds like it's the official position of the governments of India and China that they don't care what the United States does. So if that's the case, then it could be that we're imposing large social costs of. And remember, this is sort of like. It's a little bit like, if we're trying to save the planet, then the benefit side of the equation is dialed up to infinity, and so any cost of policy is justifiable. But if what we're saying is there's a material level of cost to human life and the economy that is the risk of climate change, and we're trying to avoid the risk of climate change with these policies, then you can't escape the cost-benefit analysis. And so if you're proposing policies that impose significant costs on society but don't have demonstrable benefits, that's a tough political sell. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, thanks. Mark Nevitt, Emory Law. Just two quick questions, maybe for Professor Obeysekera. There was an idea discussed I just want to glom onto about managed retreat. I'm just curious, maybe you or Professor Troxler, this idea of who should decide when we should retreat. That's my first question. And the second question is maybe for Professor Weinkle. You mentioned the Eisenhower and the Iron Triangle, and I'm really interested in this idea because I think could be a disaster reconstruction complex that's out there, which actually there's money to be made in actually a disaster response. But I'm just very curious to see if you could unpack that some more. It's a very, very interesting idea you mentioned in your presentation. So two questions: managed retreat and this idea of Iron Triangle.
Yeah, I'll give my thoughts on that, and maybe Tiffany has other ideas. I used to think that maybe in those pathways, we didn't have managed retreat as a pathway. Maybe that should always be a pathway. But in my opinion, it depends on the location, context. Like Miami Beach, they can afford to adapt to, sea level rise up to a point, right? But at some point, if their risk tolerance is low because they're being flooded, I think the community needs to decide now this is the time to have a managed retreat. Then the local governments get involved. I don't think it's the government who should go and say you should retreat. I think the community has to. That's my opinion, and that's a risk-based framing they have to have depending on the context. And that's, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's also about people's ability to adapt in place. Some people have the economic means with which to stay in place longer than others, so it's both about risk tolerance and the capacities that are necessary to extend your risk tolerance.
All right. So the classic iron triangle, for those that may not be familiar, is between a lobby group, like a business lobby, the executive agencies, and generally congressional committees. And they all kind of scratch each other's back. I would say that because, and they tend to develop in very protracted areas of policy debate, of which climate change is. And so you have individuals, the organizations that they create, develop, get involved in, and then the relationships between those organizations, particularly in the outgrowth of ESG, and you see a whole lot of mixing there and a strengthening of a lobby. But this has gone over the course of people's careers, and they've built this out. They've built relationships. They've built an industry for themselves. And so when you look at how people are connected, what firms they're working with, the sort of revolving door between academia, industry, and the agencies or advisory positions, political advisory positions, it starts to appear as this classic iron triangle. Are there specific, I have yet to be able to say, okay, it's this congressional committee, but there are congressional leaders that have taken an interest in climate change over the years. There was, what I have kind of narrowed in as a case study is this summer, which I ended up getting involved in, but because I served as a witness, but or I gave testimony. But the last summer in the Senate of the budget, there was a series of hearings about climate change and the impact and basically the creation of systemic risk by climate change, systemic financial risk. But it was kicked off by the original hearing was kicked off by two individuals that were brought in for testimony that are very much involved with advancing the idea of a climate systemic risk. And they are not, one was the economist, but I guess the point is that it's the same interests being drawn in again and again and again. And you can see that you started off the conversation with the social cost of carbon. And I don't necessarily have really strong feelings about it, but if you trace the history of the current model, you see the same people and the same organizations that have dominated the social cost of carbon space in the United States and really manage that model, manage that, at least under the Democratic Party. They have their view, their secret sauce, and that's what gets pushed forward. And I'm not saying anything about Republicans, Democrats, I could care less, but just noticing it under that party, you see very strong powers, and they have influence throughout the agencies, not just there, not just with the EPA and the social cost of carbon.
Were you gonna? Yeah, and I think we need to head to the bus here in a second. But yeah.
Oh, just very quickly, I think you made a very useful comment, Mario, when you opened the session about the difference between assessing a risk and managing it. And it's up to, in the climate sphere, it's largely up to climate scientists to affect the hazard risk, that part of the risk. The economic part, we have to hand it over to economists to do that. So my question, it was going to be to the whole panel, but we may be out of time, but it could be anyone on the panel, is I don't think we climate scientists are doing the best job we can communicating uncertainty to the people who are going to, whether it's the economists or directly policymakers, because we were not really trained to do that. And I think it's hurting us a lot. Most of the people I talk to want to communicate that risk, but even in the very much less politicized sphere of weather forecasting, we often get that wrong. Right? We know what probabilities are. We messed up in Hurricane Ian. We knew what the uncertainties were. We didn't communicate that to the government of Fort Myers Beach, and they said, oh, it's going up north, and a lot of people died. We didn't even get that right. So I guess if there's any ideas from the panel, and this can be offline, and you don't have to say it now, I think we'd be all ears on how to do this more effectively.
I would like to at least hear from Professor Troxler on that point.
How we better communicate the uncertainties around everything that we're talking about today.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the concept of safe to fail and thinking about the interdependencies of systems and trying to describe the problem as not a singular issue, but one that is interdependent and integrated with many systems. And so that begins to help people understand how complex the issue is. And with each source of complexity, we produce more uncertainty. But that's just off the cuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. We don't do a good job of communicating the uncertainties in climate projections, and it's a difficult task, but I think that should be on high priority list for our research and even in academic setting. How do we communicate to the ordinary people this uncertainty and how to incorporate that in decision making? We don't do a good job. And look at the FEMA floodplain, 100-year. People don't even understand the concept of return period, right? So I think we really have to find better ways of communicating both risk and also uncertainty.
And the reason why Obi brings up the uncertainties in the flood insurance is so that you come to tomorrow's afternoon panel sessions on that very topic. So I think we've got it. But Shahid, please.
Just one quick comment. When you have a lot of uncertainty and you communicate, you end up with no action. I mean, in the stock markets, for example, when we have a lot of periods of uncertainty, some adverse, and also when you regulate, you go with the worst case scenario. I mean, when you, for example, the requirements for reserves and so on against worst case scenarios is based on not on the median, but on the 80 percentile loss or something like that. Companies have to have reserves for so much. So when you have when you expand that uncertainty, the regulation becomes even worse, tighter, and people stop listening.
Great point. So thank you very much. We will go. So for those who have RSVP'd for the Kampong, the bus is waiting outside.
So he's with AEI now.
And we'll be leaving in 15 minutes.
My wife's maiden name is
RSVP.